J M Coetzee's Foe, 1986, is a postmodern reimagining of Daniel Defoe's classic novel Robinson Crusoe. However, Coetzee does more than retell the story. He deconstructs it, exposing its ideological underpinnings and revising it through the lens of postcolonialism, gender theory, and narrative authority. Foe centers around Susan Barton, a castaway who shares an island with Crusoe, Coetzee's spelling of Crusoe, and Friday, the silent African slave. Upon her return to England, Susan seeks to tell her story but finds her voice appropriated by the writer Daniel Foe, a fictional version of Daniel Defoe, who reshapes her experience for literary purposes. The novel explores themes of authorship, colonialism, silencing, power, and the struggle for narrative ownership. It questions who has the right to tell stories, whose voices are heard or erased, and how the act of writing is entangled with systems of control. Part 1. The Island. The novel begins with Susan Barton, the narrator, recounting her shipwreck and arrival on a remote island. There she meets Crusoe, a taciturn and disillusioned castaway who has built terraces and rudimentary shelters. Friday, a tongueless African man, is Crusoe's slave-like companion. Unlike Defoe's Crusoe, Coetzee's Crusoe is detached and passive, uninterested in escape or legacy. He refuses to write a journal, build a boat, or improve his condition. Susan is disturbed by Crusoe's authoritarian treatment of Friday, who cannot speak and whose silence becomes symbolic of deeper silences throughout the novel. Crusoe eventually dies at sea during their rescue, and Susan and Friday return to England. She resolves to tell their story, believing it to be compelling and unique. However, Friday's silence and Crusoe's disinterest leave her narrative full of gaps and uncertainties. Part 2. In Search of a Publisher. Back in England, Susan seeks out Daniel Foe, a well-known writer, to help publish her account. She writes letters to him, narrating her experience and expressing her desire to preserve the authenticity of her story. However, she quickly realizes that Foe is more interested in romanticizing and fictionalizing her experiences than honoring the truth. Foe suggests embellishing the tale, adding cannibals, pirates, and making Susan a mother searching for her lost daughter. Susan resists these changes, insisting on the truth of her lived experience. Yet she also grapples with her lack of control over the narrative, as her story is reshaped to meet the expectations of readers and publishers. Friday remains with her, but his presence is both mysterious and unsettling. Unable to speak or write, he becomes a figure of deep unknowability, resisting every attempt at interpretation. Part 3. The Writer's Control. As Susan struggles to maintain her voice, Foe takes increasing control over the narrative. She confronts the paradox that even when a woman tries to tell her own story, it is often filtered through the pen of a man. Her efforts to include Friday's perspective also fail, as his silence cannot be overcome by language. Susan's identity begins to dissolve under the pressure of Foe's rewriting. Her resistance falters, and she becomes increasingly introspective, questioning whether she ever had control over her story. The line between fact and fiction blurs, as does the boundary between narrator and author. Part 4. The Final Chapter. The novel's final, surreal chapter shifts into a new narrative voice and style. It describes a dreamlike exploration of a sunken ship, where a silent Friday is found at the bottom, holding a hidden secret, his story, his voice, or perhaps a deeper truth that language cannot capture. The novel ends ambiguously, with a haunting image of Friday's open mouth and the soundless space inside it, symbolizing the unspeakable silences of history. Analysis. 1. Revisionist fiction and intertextuality. Foe is a revisionist text, rewriting Robinson Crusoe from the perspective of the marginalized. Where Defoe's novel glorifies individualism, colonial conquest, and masculine self-reliance, Coetzee's version deconstructs these values. By introducing Susan Barton, Coetzee foregrounds the feminine voice, often excluded from canonical literature. Friday, as the African other, becomes a symbol of those whose stories have been silenced or erased by colonial discourse. The novel thus critiques the way literature has historically served imperial and patriarchal ideologies. Coetzee's intertextual strategy allows readers to reconsider the original text in light of postcolonial and feminist critique. Foe becomes not only a commentary on Defoe but on the very act of storytelling itself. 2. Silence and the politics of voice. One of the most powerful themes in Foe is silence, particularly as embodied by Friday. His tongue has been cut out, either by slavers or by Crusoe, as Susan speculates, rendering him incapable of verbal expression. Throughout the novel, characters attempt to interpret his gestures, create meaning for him, or speculate on his past. Friday's silence becomes a metaphor for historical silencing, the loss of African voices in colonial records, the inability of imperial systems to truly understand or represent the colonized. His body carries meaning, yet he remains untranslatable within the frameworks of European language and narrative. This raises profound questions. Can the subaltern speak? Can stories of the oppressed ever be told truthfully within dominant structures? Coetzee offers no easy answers, only the unsettling presence of Friday, whose silence defies appropriation. 3. Gender, authorship, and narrative control. Susan Barton is the central voice of the novel, yet her control over her own story is persistently undermined. Despite being the narrator, she must rely on a male writer, Foe, to give her tale legitimacy. Her struggle reflects the broader erasure of female experience in literary history. Foe, though not fully villainous, represents the authority of the writer as a shaper of reality. He rewrites Susan's truth into marketable fiction, suggesting that women's stories are only worth telling if they fit into familiar tropes: romance, motherhood, adventure. Susan's protest, "It is not the story I want to tell," captures the anguish of being misrepresented by those in power. 4. Postcolonial allegory. Foe can also be read as a postcolonial allegory, in which Susan represents the liberal European who seeks to give voice to the colonized, Friday, but ultimately fails to bridge the cultural divide. Her desire to speak for Friday, to impose coherence on his silence, reflects a benevolent but still colonial impulse. Coetzee critiques both imperial oppression and liberal paternalism, showing that even well-meaning attempts to include the marginalized can become forms of appropriation. Friday's silence is not a problem to be solved but a condition that exposes the limits of Western understanding. 5. Language, fiction, and truth. Foe is deeply concerned with the relationship between language and power. The novel questions whether any narrative can truly represent reality or whether all storytelling is inherently an act of shaping, editing, and fictionalizing. Susan's struggle to tell the truth is constantly thwarted, not only by Foe but by her own doubts, limitations, and biases. The novel suggests that truth is always partial, mediated, and contested. Coetzee explores the constructed nature of history, especially colonial history, which often excludes those without a written voice. 6. The ending and its symbolism. The final chapters shift into dreamlike prose and eerie imagery breaks entirely from the previous structure. Descending into the sunken ship, the narrator finds Friday lying at the bottom, submerged in silence. The scene evokes death, submersion, and historical forgetting, but also a sense of hidden depth and mystery. Friday's unopened mouth, containing the slow stream of bubbles, suggests that there is a story, a truth, that lies beyond the reach of language. The novel ends not with resolution, but with a haunting silence, forcing the reader to confront the limits of storytelling. Conclusion. J M Coetzee's Foe is a rich, complex, and unsettling novel that deconstructs the foundations of colonial literature, challenges assumptions about authorship and voice, and confronts the enduring power of silence. Through the characters of Susan, Friday, and Foe, Coetzee explores the intersections of gender, race, and power, revealing how stories are constructed, and who gets left out. Far more than a retelling of Robinson Crusoe, Foe is a meditation on the ethics of narrative, the impossibility of speaking for the other, and the uneasy legacy of colonialism in literature. It demands that readers question what they know, how they know it, and whose voices they trust. Ultimately, Foe refuses to give us closure. Instead, it leaves us with the image of silence, heavy, enduring, and eloquent in its refusal to be translated. It is a silence that calls not for interpretation but for recognition. Coetzee's novel, like Friday's open mouth, challenges us to listen more deeply, even when no words are spoken.